All right, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the world leaders, now praising the Iranian protesters who are challenging the rule of their country's hardline regime. Meanwhile, North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un with another warning for the United States today as part of his New Year's address to the people. What a warm and lovely message he had, saying he always has a nuclear button on his desk, and once again claiming the rogue regime has missiles capable of striking anywhere in the United States. Former U.S. Ambassador to the UN John Bolton saying, well, we've heard this before.
It's propaganda from Kim Jong Un. This is his regular New Year's speech, and obviously he has seen the conversation in the United States that looks at possible preemptive military force, not as the most attractive option, but as an option that we definitely have to use if they don't give up their nuclear weapons program. So we need a very careful calibration exactly what the North's capabilities are.
Rich Edson back from the warmth of the winter White House and travels with the president back in D.C. With more. The president was asked last night, talked a little bit last night about North Korea.
He did talk about it, responding, Leland, to what we heard from the New Year's Day address from Kim Jong Un, which was essentially threats against the United States, though an offer to calm the tension on the Korean Peninsula. In that address, North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un bragged about his regime's nuclear and ballistic missile development. He says, quote, "The entire United States is within range of our nuclear weapons. A nuclear button is always on my desk. This is not reality, not a threat. This year, we should focus on mass-producing nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles for operational deployment. These weapons will be used only if our society is threatened." Though the leader, who regularly launches ballistic missiles over Japan, says North and South Korea should calm the situation there. He says, quote, "When it comes to North-South relations, we should lower the military tensions on the Korean Peninsula to create a peaceful environment. Both the North and the South should make efforts." He even says North and South Korea should meet to discuss North Korea sending athletes to the Olympics in South Korea next month. President Trump, in response to all this, says, "We'll see." His administration says it continues pressing other countries to cut off North Korea. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says the U.S. and North Korea would begin discussions only when Kim changes his behavior, Leland.
Yeah, some discussion that olive branch, the South, may be trying to sort of drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. That's in one side of the world. The other side of the world, we have these Iranian protests turning deadly. President Trump responding to them very differently than his predecessor, right?
That's what his administration is contending. That will be different, though it remains to see what exactly this administration is going to do. As Iran's president is now saying, they have the right to protest, though the demonstrators, as he said, should not make the public feel concerned about their lives and security. Iranian state media report more than 10 are dead, and there was an attempt to seize military and police installations. Meanwhile, world leaders are weighing in on what's going on in Iran, in particular Iran's enemies, like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel.
Brave Iranians are pouring into the streets. They seek freedom, they seek justice, they seek the basic liberties that have been denied to them for decades. Iran's cruel regime wastes tens of billions of dollars spreading hate. This money could have built schools and hospitals. No wonder mothers and fathers are marching in the streets. The regime is terrified of them, of their own people.
Thousands are protesting a poor economy while Iran engages in costly proxy wars across the Middle East. These are the largest protests in Iran since 2009.
Yeah, since the Green Revolution. Important question, though. We discussed this a little bit yesterday. We've heard from President Trump on Twitter a number of times supporting these Iranian protesters, saying the world is watching. We just heard from the vice president also saying that we can't let these protesters down, saying the United States in some way, yet to be determined, is going to stand up for these protesters. What about the reaction from Europe? So often it's the Europeans who can't wait to jump out in front of any kind of human rights violations. You've got people being killed in the streets of Iran. Anything from the Brits, the Germans, the French, the Italians?
Well, the criticism that we've heard from so many in the United States about the Europeans is that they have increased their business with Iran as a result of the Iran nuclear deal, and they have been more hesitant to criticize the Iran regime as a result of that. As the United States moves forward and it says that it's now no longer certifying that Iran is complying with the Iran nuclear agreement, the Europeans have very much wanted the United States to stay in that Iran nuclear deal as part of the increased business that they've had there, though also the Europeans point out if the United States gets out of the Iran nuclear deal, the problem there is then they've gotten the upfront benefits of the Iranian regime. However, the United States, by reimposing sanctions, a lot of that money is already gone to the Iran regime. Yeah, and as Prime Minister Netanyahu pointed out, we know where at least a lot of that money was spent by the Iranian government. Rich Edson, Washington, D.C., more on this as it happens, certainly at the State Department this week. Thanks, Rich.
We know stocks were surging all year on hopes for tax cuts. Well, now we got them, signed, sealed, and delivered. Are they enough to deliver another rally? Let's ask Catherine Rooney-Vera, Jonas Max Faris, and Gary Kaltbaum. Good to see you all. Gary, I'm going to start with you. How are you thinking about this year? How are we set up? And can we continue the upside?
Well, so far going into the new year, I've seen nothing, not even a 2% correction. And every time something tops out, something new shows up. And late in the year, we got retail, transports, energy, commodities really strong as we move in. For me, the only thing that can stop the market right now is we've not had a correction in a very long time, and we're way overdue. So my bet is sometime during the year, we'll probably have a 5 to 10%er. But as long as interest rates stay low, as long as these maniac central banks keep printing money and keeping rates down at zero, and as long as earnings continue to be strong, which I do believe will occur, I think the market will be okay, and I think we'll have another decent year.
That all sounds kind of good, but you did throw that 5 to 10% correction in there. Let me ask Catherine.
Which would be normal.
But there's a lot of good fundamentals out there, aren't there, Catherine?
There are, and I'll say that I'll take the other side of that, Gary. I don't think that markets die of old age. Economic cycles don't die of old age. There are some risks on the horizons, but it's not because we're due. That's not how markets correct. So we could get a surge in inflation, and the Fed has to hike, feels itself behind the curve, has to hike more aggressively than the market is currently pricing in, which is 2-3 hikes max.
But to get that surge in inflation, we need to start seeing wages improve dramatically. Jonas, it's been 30 years and people haven't really gotten much of a wage increase. We're barely keeping pace with inflation. Does that change given the tax cuts?
Well, we never had tax cuts really going into this strong a situation, both with low interest rates, real estate prices already going up, unemployment really low. Everything's really good, except if you want to argue that wages is probably the only weak indicator. And again, it's not weak, it's just not going up as fast as everything else seems to be going up, house prices included. So no one really knows what's going to happen. There's no indicator that's going to say the market's going to tank or the economy's going to tank any more than there was in 2000 when the last time consumer confidence was about this high. Really, the only risk is too much confidence and too much, it has to turn at some point. It's not going to go on for, it might not die of old age, but it does die, and that's, you don't know when it's going to happen.
I want to follow that through, Jonas, because you're saying, basically in 2000, suddenly everybody woke up and said, yeah, maybe it doesn't make sense to have some crazy, insane valuation on some sneaker company just because they happen to sell sneakers online. That was when reality caught up with people. But I'll tell you, as that whole thing was developing, I really questioned it, and I think a lot of people were out there questioning it. I don't know as I'm hearing as many questions right now, Jonas. Is that fair? It feels like economic fundamentals are improving. We got policy that's making sense on the economic front. What is it that's crazy right now?
Well, and that's we might only be in 1997 argument. There could be a few more years of this to come before we get to really insane levels. The last two crashes and major recessions really happened because bubbles popped. Then it was tech stocks, and in 05, 06, 07, it was real estate, which was overpriced and too much of people's assets. We don't really have a tremendous underlying bubble, but I tell you, it's getting close both in stocks and this whole cryptocurrency thing. How many trillions of dollars of market value do you think you have wrapped up in that before when that collapse happens, that causes a recession? I don't think we're quite there yet. but it's getting close to the dot-com bubble size in total value almost. So I think there's things to watch out for, and they're based in overconfidence and over this wealth effect going too far. It's too much of a good thing. But again, we're probably not there yet. You probably could say it's got a couple more years before things get totally insane.
I'll have to take the other side of that too, because I do think there's a bubble in Bitcoin. But I don't think there's a bubble in the S&P 500. What moves equity prices? It's earnings. What moves earnings? You know, growing your bottom line. You can do that very easily and very quickly by cutting taxes, cutting costs. What cuts costs?
We
right?
you
cut costs by cutting taxes and cutting
500.
regulation. Both of which are happening.
Right, but by the same logic, there was no bubble in the S&P 500 back in 05, 06. It was the real estate bubble when that came down that took down the S&P 500. You could have the same thing if a different bubble comes down.
Right, so but we don't see a bubble really on the horizon. And Gary, you know, I know you talked about 5-10% correction, which would be, you know, theoretically healthy for markets. Those things happen all the time. Yeah. But there's nothing out there lurking as far as anyone sees right now in the here and now that could cause this whole thing to come crashing down. I mean, maybe if tax reform hadn't gotten through, Gary, but it did.
Well, let me say this. You never know what's on the horizon, but we still have massive debt, massive deficits. They are going to grow. But I said, as long as interest rates cooperate, that for me is the big matzo ball out there, that if interest rates all of a sudden get out of hand to the upside, then I think the market can take the hit. And let me just repeat something.
That would require there being a lot of inflation in the economy.
Not necessarily. Just remember, we're very, very low, and if they just decide, if rates itself, just the market itself normalizes, you can go back into the 3s and 4s on the 10-year. I think that affects markets. But just to go back to one thing I said, because I don't think I was understood, all I'm saying is 5 to 10% would be as normal can be. The one thing we didn't have in 2017 was a real good ebb and flow. You're supposed to have corrections along the way, and we didn't hardly see any of them. And I just think we're due, and I think probably 2018 we'll see it, but I think it's going to be a no biggie at this point in time.
High after high after high. You're predicting 3,000 on the S&P, Catherine?
Yeah, I think we get to 3,000. Of course, there's risks. You have geopolitical risks. You have policy risk. The administration could leave NAFTA and WTO. These are things that would precipitate a correction, I think 5 to 10%. But with earnings growth validating current multiples, we can get to 2950, 3,000, I think, by the end of next year.
Wow. All right. We're watching all of it. It's so good to see you guys.
All right. There's a lot to unpack here. Let's bring in Troy Slayton, a criminal defense lawyer and former prosecutor who specializes in constitutional law. Troy, Happy New Year. Thank you for being here to talk about this subject, this unfolding matter that just seems to keep going.
Happy New Year, Molly.
Yeah, let's kick off with what the Congressman Devin Nunes is trying to accomplish. There's this Wednesday deadline looming, and what he wants is information from the Department of Justice, from the FBI. He wants to get to the bottom of the whole dossier subject, what it was used for, when it came into the hands of the FBI. Will he get the answers he's seeking, and will he see them by any chance sometime this week?
Well, he might or he might not. Congress has not only the absolute power, but the duty to conduct oversight over the FBI and the Department of Justice. And so if the FBI and the DOJ aren't willing to voluntarily turn over documents and other materials related to anything that Congress wants to find out about, then they issue subpoenas. But the problem comes with the enforcement of a subpoena. There may be very good reasons to not comply with the subpoena, that there's classified information, that it affects national security, that there's an ongoing criminal investigation like we know there is here. But you just can't not respond. But the problem is, if they just don't respond and Congress wants to enforce the subpoena, they'd have to go to the DOJ. And certainly DOJ lawyers aren't going to go to court to seek a remedy or contempt against themselves.
Yeah, what about that? A possible contempt of Congress? There's, as you mentioned, this is a big, complicated web. Could we see some sort of action taken if they don't see what they want to see by midweek, by the 3rd?
Well, that would be the remedy normally under the normal course for Congress then to ask the Justice Department to file contempt proceedings in federal court. But here, it's the Justice Department itself that is not complying. And if the reason why they're not complying is a question about national security or classified documents, there are ways to handle that, especially with the Intelligence Committee. They have secret rooms that they're able to share information with the Congress men and women without having the worry that that information will be largely disseminated.
All right, now let's shift to this New York Times report that this former aide to the Trump campaign, George Papadopoulos, may have had this drunken conversation back in May of 2016, speaking with an Australian diplomat, that he knew the Russians had some dirt on Hillary Clinton, and then ultimately that diplomat passing information on to the U.S. intelligence. The idea behind this report is that, hey, maybe it wasn't the dossier, this came first, this conversation came first. But does it matter exactly how the FBI got this investigation started? The political sides seem to really want each estimate to matter, but does it ultimately matter from a legal circumstance?
Well, it may, because if the sole impetus to start this investigation was this largely discredited Steele dossier that looks like it was funded by the Clinton campaign, by the DNC, then that provides a problem. Then it looks like it was the DNC that paid to have an investigation of the Trump campaign. But if there are other more innocuous reasons why the investigation was started that provided the probable cause for the FBI to seek the FISA warrants that may have provided legal grounds for surveillance on Trump aides, then that is a really big deal.
Yeah, so then the repercussions in essence. But at the same time, it wouldn't change the actions that were taken regarding the dossier. If the DNC and the Clinton campaign still paid for everything that went down and that ultimately led to the creation of this dossier, it doesn't change, the actions that were taken by those people, those entities, those individuals, right?
Absolutely, and you can't unring the bell.
Right.
The investigation is started. So whatever reason the investigation is started, we're far down that path. A special counsel has been appointed. Mueller is conducting the investigation, and although there are arguments and good arguments coming from Republicans about the independence of the special counsel and some possible appearance of impropriety that may be involved with some of the prosecutors and investigators on Mueller's team, the investigation is underway and is going to go forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of digging to be done. Still, that question, the chicken or the egg, which came first? I'm sure the answers will come out on that, hopefully in the end, and we'll get a lot of these answers. Troy Sladen, we appreciate it. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Molly.